Welcome back to Cowboy Ironheart. Tonight, the prairie wind carries a story of a broken heart, finding its sanctuary in the wild. Let us journey back to the frontier, where love is the only strength that matters. Our story begins now. She had said it once, 9 months ago, at the fence line on a Tuesday afternoon in the middle of a conversation about something else entirely. She had said it the way you said small, true things when the conversation had the quality that permitted them to surface without warning. But said it without weight and without any expectation that the saying of it would be particularly retained by the person she was saying it to. She had said that her birthday had been the previous week. She had said that William had never remembered it. She had said she had learned not to mention it because the mentioning produced something worse than the forgetting. She had said all of it in 30 seconds and had moved on to the fence rail and had not thought about it again. He had heard every word. 9 months later, on the morning of the day that had not been remembered for 3 years, she walked out to the eastern fence line at dawn for the morning check and found wildflowers on the nearest post, the specific wildflowers from the section of his property near the shared fence. The ones she had mentioned once in a different conversation that she found particularly beautiful, tied with a piece of twine. No note, no name, simply the flowers in the early light. But placed where she would find them on the morning, she needed to find them. She stood with the wildflowers in her hands. She said, "You remembered." She said it to the empty field. She meant it for him. Welcome to Cowboy Ironheart. If this already has you, leave us a word below. Their paths have finally crossed, but the trail ahead is long. If you're touched by this journey of healing, please subscribe and join us here at Cowboy Ironheart. Now, let's see how their story unfolds. There is a particular kind of woman who learned to carry things without letting the carrying show, who had refined the specific art of maintaining the exterior surface of adequacy while the interior was doing considerably more complicated work, and who had arrived at such a thorough mastery of the distinction between the two that most people who encountered her in the daily course of the daily life would have assessed her as fine and moved on with the specific efficiency of people who had their own interiors to manage and who were satisfied by the available evidence. Clara Ford had that mastery, and she had been exercising it for longer than the 11 months of her residency in Emberfield, Montana. Had been exercising it for the better part of 3 years in the specific daily practice of someone for whom the performance of adequacy had become the primary available form of self-protection, and who had arrived at the 11 months in Emberfield with the mastery so complete and so automatic that she was not always certain herself where the performance ended and the actual condition began. She had not always been the performing adequacy version of herself. She had been, before the events that produced it, someone with the specific quality of presence that was the natural expression of a person who had not yet learned to manage their own visibility. Warm and curious and genuinely interested in the world and in the people she encountered in it. The kind of person who remembered what you had said and who produced from the remembering the specific follow-up that told you the remembering was real. Who laughed easily and who had opinions about things and who expressed those opinions without waiting to be asked, and who was. And the Illinois town of Copperfield, where she had grown up as the eldest daughter of a mill owner and his wife. A girl who existed in her full dimensions without having learned yet that the full dimensions required managing. Her father had been a man of considerable warmth and the specific dry humor of someone who found the world genuinely funny in its particulars, rather than in its generalities. And he had given Clara the quality of her attention, which was the quality of genuine interest in the specific person and the specific situation, rather than the general category. And which was the most valuable quality she possessed, and the one that had served her best and cost her most across the years that followed. Her mother had been practical and warm in the specific way of women who managed large households with the minimum necessary drama, and who communicated love primarily through the sustained competence of the management, rather than through its announcement. And from her mother, Clara had the specific capable quality of someone who understood that the work was the care and that the doing of the work well was the most available form of the caring. She had met William Ford when she was 24, at a gathering in the county seat that she had attended with her younger sister and that William had attended because he had business with the man whose house it was. William had been 29 and had possessed the specific quality of someone who understood social situations and who moved through them with a fluency that she had found at 24, genuinely. Impressive, and that she had not understood at 24 was a skill that was entirely distinct from the quality of being genuinely present with another person. He had focused on her with the complete attention of someone who had decided what he wanted. And she had found the focusing flattering and genuine feeling in the way that the focusing of someone who was very good at focusing felt genuine. And she had not understood at 24 the distinction between being focused on and being seen. They had married the following year. She had gone with him to the town of Henderson's Mill in western Illinois, where his land agent business was established. And she had built her sewing practice there, with the patient, practical intelligence she brought to all things that required building. And the first year had been good in the specific way of first years that were not yet anything other than the beginning. The way of two people who were still in the process of discovering each other and whose discovery had not yet produced all of its results. The discovery had produced most of its results in the second year. The third year had been the year in which she had understood, in the specific way that understanding arrived when it was not going to wait for you to be ready for it, that the man she had married and the man she had thought she was marrying were not the same person, and that the distance between them was not a distance that could be crossed through the application of patience and focused intelligence and genuine care, because the distance was not produced by any deficit in her own provision, but was produced by a quality in him that was structural rather than circumstantial. William had been the specific kind of man who was present in the surfaces and absent in the depths, who had the quality of genuine engagement that operated at the level of the social encounter and that did not extend beyond it, who was charming and competent and reliably pleasant in the way of someone who had organized their entire relationship with the world around the management of impression rather than the development of genuine connection, and who had produced in Clara, across the 3 years of the marriage, the specific experience of someone who was living alongside another person who was not there in the way that mattered. The birthday was the clearest symbol of the pattern, not because it was the largest element of it, but because it had a date, and the date was either remembered or it was not. And the not remembering of it in the first year had been received by Clara with the generous interpretation of someone who was newly married and who wanted to believe the best. And the not remembering in the second year had been received with the specific recalibration of someone whose generous interpretation was encountering insufficient evidence to sustain itself. And the not remembering in the third year had been received with the specific quiet settling of someone who had arrived at the accurate understanding and was making the necessary peace with it. She had learned not to mention it because the mentioning had produced across the years of the marriage the specific quality of William's response to being reminded of a failure, not anger, which would have been at least honest in its directness, but the particular management of someone who was very good at managing, who converted her need into evidence of her unreasonableness and her expression of the need into an occasion for a specific kind of patient explanation that left her feeling that the problem had been located and the problem was her. She had learned that the simplest available path was the not mentioning. And the not mentioning had become so habitual that she had arrived at the specific condition of someone who had forgotten that she was allowed to want the wanting acknowledged. William had died in October of the year before her arrival in Emberfield, a sudden illness of the kind that produced no warning, and that had been over before the full understanding of what was happening had arrived. A doctor had come and had done what could be done, and the outcome had been what the outcome was. And she had sat in the Henderson's Mill house on the October evening, after the burial, with the specific complicated quality of feeling that she had been afraid she would feel and had felt anyway, which was the grief that was real and the relief that was also real, and the guilt about the relief and the grief for the life she had hoped for, rather than the life she had lived. All of it present simultaneously in the specific tangled way of things that did not wait for their resolution before arriving. She had stayed in Henderson's Mill for 8 months. The staying had been the correct response to the immediate period because the leaving required the specific internal resources that had not been replenished yet. And the replenishment required the time that the time was requiring. And she had been patient with the time in the specific patient way that she had learned to be patient with things that could not be rushed. She had been building the resources slowly and honestly and in the specific way of things that built correctly rather than quickly. And at the end of the 8 months, she had the resources that the leaving required, and she had used them. She had chosen Emberfield, Montana, because the woman who ran the dry goods in Henderson's Mill had a cousin who had written about the Montana Territory with the specific enthusiasm of someone who had found a place that matched something in them that the previous place had not matched. And because the notice in the regional paper about the growing communities of the Northern Territory needing skilled tradespeople had been the kind of specific practical notice that a specific practical plan could be built around. And because Emberfield was far enough from Illinois that the version of her that Illinois had decided she was would not have traveled with her. She had arrived in November of the previous year with the sewing kit and the modest remaining capital and the specific patient determination of a woman who had decided on the forward direction and was moving in it with the full available commitment. The sewing work had grown in the specific efficient way of good work in small communities through the reputation that quality built without announcement. And she had commissions enough to be solvent, and the sustainability was building in the way she had come to build things since Henderson's Mill, which was correctly and without rushing. The small house on the eastern edge of Emberfield was adequate, and the landlord was the practical, undemanding sort, and she had been in Emberfield for 11 months, and she had been doing what she had come to do, which was to build a life in a place where the building was available. She had been managing her presence in Emberfield with the focused care that had become her characteristic mode, not withdrawing from the community in any way that would have generated the particular concern that withdrawal generated in small places, but engaging at the level that was sufficient for the practical requirements of the daily life without being sufficient to produce the particular intimacy that she had learned was its own kind of exposure. She had been warm and professional and appropriately self-sufficient, and she had given the people of Emberfield no reason to look too closely at the version of her that was present in their community. She had been aware of Gideon Cross in the specific peripheral way of someone who was aware of the minimum necessary about the people in their regular social environment. Aware that he had the adjacent property, and that he was known in the community as reliable and as someone who had been there for 6 years, and who had built the Cross spread into something that reflected the quality of sustained, honest work. Aware that he came to town on Tuesdays, and that he was large enough to be immediately visible in any context and to change the quality of any space he occupied simply by being in it. She had been aware of all of this with the minimum necessary quality of awareness and had not been paying particular attention in any sense that was more specific than that. She had been at the fence line on the May Tuesday when the conversation had happened, the conversation that had produced the birthday observation 9 months later. She had been doing the eastern boundary check, and she had found the section of shared fence that needed the attention that shared fences required, and she had sent word to the Cross spread in that practical way of people who shared fence lines and who understood the practical infrastructure of the relationship. He had come that afternoon, and they had worked through the assessment with the focused practical quality of two people who understood the same work. And the conversation had had the specific quality of conversation between people who were primarily engaged with a practical task and who were talking in the natural pauses that the task produced rather than for the purpose of the conversation itself. She had said the birthday thing the way small true things surfaced in conversations of that quality, not planning it and not weighing it and not attaching any expectation to the saying of it. She had said it and moved on to the fence rail and had not thought about it again. She had not known that the man across the fence was the kind of man who retained what people said because the person was the reason for the retaining. She had not known that the 2 words of her birthday and the specific quality of how she said them were going to be held carefully for 9 months, and that 9 months later she was going to stand in the early morning of the day itself and find on the fence post the specific wildflowers that meant she had been heard in the specific way she had given up expecting to be heard. She stood in the morning with the wildflowers in her hands. The Montana dawn was around her with the specific quality of a high country dawn, vast and clear and entirely itself. The sky still holding the last of the dark in its upper reaches, while the lower sky was the specific pale gold that was the beginning of the day. She said, "You remembered." She said it to the empty field, and she meant it for the man she could not see, but whose presence in the far section of the cross spread she understood as surely as she understood the direction of the morning light. And the saying of it was the most honest 2 words she had said in 11 months in Emberfield, which was itself the information she had been avoiding, looking at directly. She looked at it now. It was time. There are men who listen to the world the way good farmers listen to the land, not with the particular attentiveness of someone who was gathering information for a specific purpose, which was a different quality of listening and produce different results. But with the comprehensive patient attentiveness of someone for whom the accurate understanding of what was in front of them was the primary available form of respect for the thing being listened to, and who understood that the listening which was organized around a purpose was fundamentally different from the listening which was organized around the thing itself. Gideon Cross had the second kind of listening, and he had developed it across 37 years of paying the right quality of attention to the land and the seasons and the animals and the people he encountered in the course of the daily life. And it was not a skill he had cultivated through deliberate effort, but the specific natural expression of someone for whom the world was genuinely interesting in its particulars, and who had found, through long experience, that the particulars were available only to the kind of attention that was not managing toward a conclusion. He had grown up in eastern Montana, the eldest of two brothers in a farming family that had been working the same land for 2 generations, and that had the specific relationship with the northern high country that 2 generations of sustained work produced. The relationship of people who understood the land in the body rather than the mind, and who had passed that understanding down through the specific method of demonstrating it daily rather than explaining it. His father had been a man of almost no unnecessary language and very considerable dignity, who communicated what mattered through the quality of what he did and through the specific quality of his presence, which was the presence of someone who was entirely located in the place they were and who was not managing toward anywhere else. His mother had been a woman of warm intelligence and the specific, precise humor of someone who had found the human situation genuinely funny in its specifics, and who had given Gideon the quality of his attention to people, which was the quality of someone who found people interesting in their particularity, rather than their generality, and who paid the specific kind of attention that noticed what was not being said as clearly as it noticed what was. He had been large since early adolescence, in the way that required the specific management that large men who were not careless about their effect on the people around them learned to practice. And he had practiced it for long enough that it was no longer practice, but simply how he occupied the world, the unhurried deliberateness of his movements, the specific way he settled into spaces that were not built for him without making the not fitting a problem for the space or the people in it. The particular quality of his stillness, which was not the stillness of someone who was suppressing their natural motion, but the genuine stillness of someone who understood that stillness was itself a form of communication, and that the communication it produced was one he found useful. He had been told across his adult life that he was difficult to read, and he had received this observation with the equanimity of someone who understood that being difficult to read was not the same as being absent. But it was simply the evidence that the reading required more than the surface. He had come to the Emberfield area 6 years ago when the land adjacent to what would become the Ford property had been available and when his accumulated capital had been sufficient to the purchase. He had built the cross spread across the 6 years with the patient, systematic quality that was his characteristic mode for all things that required building, which meant he had built it correctly rather than quickly. And the result was the specific result that correct building produced, which was the result that lasted. He was known in Emberfield as reliable and quiet, and as someone who had been there long enough to have earned the particular form of community respect that was given to people who had demonstrated their character through the sustained evidence of what they did, rather than through what they claimed. He had known of the Ford property before Clara arrived, had known the previous owner and the specific quality of the land and the particular requirements of the eastern boundary fence that was the shared boundary between the 2 spreads. He had first been aware of Clara Ford in her 2nd week in Emberfield, which was the 2nd week of November, when he had seen her in the dry goods with the specific quality of someone doing a practical errand, with the focused efficiency of a person who was directing all available attention to the practical requirement and the minimum necessary to the social context. He had registered her with the comprehensive, unhurried attentiveness that was simply how he registered most things in his environment. And what he had registered had settled in him with the specific weight of something that was going to be returned to. He had not immediately understood the full quality of what he had registered. He had understood that she was beautiful in the specific way that was more significant than the conventional beauty of someone who had been given the right features, which was the beauty of someone who was entirely present in their own face, without performing or managing the presence. The beauty that was the direct expression of an interior quality rather than a surface quality. He had understood that she was managing her engagement with the community, with the focused efficiency he had observed, and that the management was organized around something he had not yet had. Sufficient information to characterize accurately. And he had understood that she was someone who paid the right kind of attention, which was itself the rarest available piece of information about a person and the one that told him most. He had been paying attention to her across the 11 months with the same patient, comprehensive quality he brought to most things he found worth attending to, which meant without agenda and without the particular urgency that would have compressed the accumulation of understanding into something less thorough than the thorough version. He had seen her in the community context and at the fence line for the practical exchanges that the shared boundary required. And he had accumulated the specific understanding that the sustained patient attention produced across sufficient time, which was the understanding that was thorough rather than partial and accurate rather than approximate. What he had come to understand was this. She was someone whose interior was considerably richer and more engaged than the surface she maintained in the community's presence. And the maintaining of the surface was not a form of dishonesty, but a form of protection. And the protection was the response to something specific rather than to a general wariness about the world. And the something specific was what she was carrying in the specific, invisible way of someone who had learned that the invisible carrying was the safest available form of the carrying. He had understood the quality of the carrying from the specific quality of how she moved through the ordinary daily requirements of the community life. There was a particular way that people moved when they were managing something significant in the interior while executing the ordinary exterior. A specific quality of focused forward attention that was the attention of someone whose resources were allocated in a way that left the forward-facing operational at the necessary level, while the interior was doing its more demanding work in the background. He knew this quality because he had seen it before and because he had the kind of attention that recognized it accurately. He had not said anything about what he understood because the saying of it would have required an approach that was not yet appropriate. And he was not a man who made approaches before they were appropriate. He had been patient with the timing in the way he was patient with most things that required patience, which was the active way rather than the passive way. The way of someone who was present to the situation at the level the situation required and who was not going to introduce a variable until the situation indicated the variable was appropriate. The May fence line conversation had happened in the natural way of practical occasions that produced natural conversation. And she had said the birthday thing, the way she said things at the fence line in general, which was with slightly more of the actual interior available than she allowed in the more public contexts of the community. The fence line having the specific quality of a practical shared task that reduced the social management because the task itself was providing the organizational structure for the time. He had heard every word of the birthday thing with a complete quality of his characteristic listening. And he had understood from the specific quality of how she said it, not just the content of what she was saying, but the interior of it, which was the interior of someone for whom the not being remembered had been accepted as the available condition for long enough that the acceptance was no longer even grief, but simply the furniture of the daily life. He had understood this, and he had held it in the interior place where he held significant things, and he had determined, not immediately, but across the weeks and months that followed, what the correct response to the holding of it was. He had thought about the birthday with the same patient, returning consideration he brought to things he was in the process of understanding fully. And he had arrived at the wildflowers not through any dramatic process of decision-making, but through the specific clarity of someone who had been paying the right kind of attention for long enough to understand what the right response was and what form it needed to take. The form needed to be simple, not a gesture and not an announcement, not anything that required her to receive it in any particular way or to respond to it with any particular acknowledgement. Simply the evidence placed where she would find it that she had been heard in the specific way she had stopped, expecting to be heard. It heard not in the social way of words entering someone's awareness and being processed and released, but in the specific retaining way of someone for whom what she had said mattered because she was the reason it mattered. He had gone out before dawn on the morning of the birthday, which he knew, because he had retained the date from the May conversation in the specific way. He retained things that mattered. And he had taken the wildflowers from the section of the cross spread near the shared fence, the one she had mentioned in a different conversation in June that she found particularly beautiful. And he had tied them with a piece of twine in the plain, honest way, and had placed them on the nearest fence post, and had returned to the far section of the cross, spread for the morning's first work. He had not planned to be in a position to hear her when she found them. He had been in the far section because the far section was where the morning's first work was, and that was where he was. The Montana dawn carried sound in the specific way it carried sound which was further than the day's wind permitted, and he had heard the two words with the complete quality of his hearing. You remembered. He had heard them, and he had understood from the specific quality of them everything that the two words contained, which was considerably more than two words typically contained, and which was exactly what he had understood it would be when he had placed the flowers in the early dark. He had stood in the far section with the morning's first work around him, and he had allowed the two words to be what they were, which was the most honest available expression of someone who had been remembered in the specific way they had given up expecting to be remembered. And the allowing of them to be what they were was itself the form of receiving that the moment required, the quiet completion of the specific exchange that the wildflowers had begun. He went to the fence line at mid-morning, not because he had planned to go to the fence line at mid-morning, but because the fence line was the natural place for the next part of the conversation. And the next part of the conversation was something that needed to happen between two people and not between one person and an empty field. He came to the section of fence nearest the post, and he found her there, not because she had known he would come, she had not, but because the fence line was where the morning check had taken her, and the morning check had taken longer on this particular morning because the attention that the morning check usually received had been occupied with something else. She looked up when she heard him approach. She had the wildflowers in the pocket of her work apron in the way of something small that had been put somewhere safe, because the putting of it somewhere safe was the natural response to a thing that needed to be protected while its meaning was still being understood. He came to the fence and he stopped, and he looked at her with the dark green eyes that were warm in the morning light, and the way she was finding was simply their quality rather than a quality. Produced for specific occasions. He said good morning. She said good morning. There was a moment in the morning between the good morning and whatever came next. And the moment had the specific quality of two people who had passed through something in the last few hours that had changed the quality of the territory they were standing in. She said the wildflowers. He said yes, she said, from the section near the creek. He said yes. He said it with the plain quality that did not elaborate, because the elaboration was not the point. She said, you heard what I said. He said, I heard what you said 9 months ago. He said, I heard what you said this morning. She said, both. He said, yes. She said, why did you remember it? He considered this with the honest consideration he appeared to give to things that mattered. He said, because you were the reason for the remembering. He said, not what you said. He said, you. She looked at him across the fence with the blue-gray eyes that were showing more than they usually showed, and he looked back with the dark green ones, and the Montana morning was around them, and the wildflowers were in her apron pocket, and neither of them said anything for a moment that had more inside it than the available words would have fit. She said, nobody has remembered my birthday in 3 years. He said, I know. She said, you've known for 9 months. He said, yes. She said, and you waited until this morning to do something about it. He said, the morning of the birthday was the correct moment, he said. Doing something about it before the morning of the birthday would have been doing it for the wrong reason. She said, what was the right reason? He said, the right reason was that it was your birthday, and that it had not been remembered, and that I was in a position to remember it, and that the not doing it when you were in a position to do it was simply the wrong choice. She said, that's a very specific way to think about it. He said, I'm a specific person. She said, I'm beginning to understand that. She said it, and the morning was around them, and the fence line was between them, and everything that had just been said was in the air between them, in the specific way of things that had been said honestly and that were now simply there. Present and real and not requiring anything further from the moment, except that the moment hold them. He said, come to the fence line on Thursday. He said it with the same plain quality. She said, what's on Thursday? He said, I have a section of the southern boundary that needs attention. He said it would go faster with 2. He said it with the dry quality that was itself a form of honesty. The acknowledgement that the section of the southern boundary was the available practical reason and that the available practical reason was also something else. And she received the quality of the honesty and said Thursday. He said, yes. She said, I'll be there. He said, good. He said it with the specific plain completeness of his characteristic word, and he turned back toward the far section of the cross spread where the morning's remaining work was. And she stood at the fence line in the Montana morning with the wildflowers in her apron pocket and the blue-gray eyes that were showing more than they had been showing before this morning. The showing was not something she was managing back into the managed territory. She let it show. It was the first thing in 11 months she had not managed. Felt in the specific honest way of things that felt like what they were, like the beginning of something. She put the wildflowers in the small blue pitcher on the kitchen windowsill, the pitcher that had been her grandmother's, and that was the one object she had brought from Henderson's mill, that was entirely hers in the specific sense of having been present in her life before William and remaining after him. The object that was the thread of continuity in what had otherwise been a sequence of discontinuities. She filled it with water from the morning's bucket, and she arranged the wildflowers in it with the specific careful attention of someone for whom the arranging was itself a form of receiving the thing that had been given. A way of honoring it with the full quality of her attention rather than simply setting it somewhere and moving on with the morning. She stood at the kitchen window with the wildflowers in the blue pitcher and the morning light coming through the glass at the specific angle of a Montana birthday morning in February. Low and pale and clear in the way of winter light, at altitude that was honest in its illumination without being generous in its warmth. And she looked at the wildflowers, and she let herself feel the full quality of what the morning had been without the managing that had been her response to most things for most of the previous 3 years and the previous 11 months. The managing had served her. She understood that and was not dismissing it. The managing had been the correct response to the specific conditions of the specific time it had been the response to. And it had kept her functional and solvent and moving forward in the specific practical ways that moving forward required. But the managing had also been a form of cost, and the cost was the specific cost of someone who was spending internal resources on the maintenance of a posture rather than on the living of a life. And the February morning, with the wildflowers in the blue pitcher, was showing her the size of the cost in the specific way that things showed their size when you set them down for a moment and felt the weight of the setting down. She was lighter, not dramatically, not in the way of something that had been suddenly relieved of a great weight, and that was celebrating the relief. But lighter in the specific incremental way of things that changed when the conditions that were producing the not lighter changed. And what had changed this morning was something she was still in the process of understanding fully, but that she could feel in the specific quality of the standing at the window, which was the quality of someone who was actually standing at a window looking at wildflowers rather than the quality of someone who was executing the standing at a window while managing the standing and the wildflowers and the implications of both. She went back to the work of the morning with the focused practical quality that was her characteristic mode. And the work went the way it went when the interior had slightly more available to it than the day before. The needlework was precise in a way that needlework was precise when the person holding the needle was genuinely in the holding of it. And the commissions she was working through were going better in a way she could feel in the quality of the execution. She worked through the morning, and the wildflowers were in the blue pitcher on the windowsill, and the light moved across the kitchen in the specific way of February, light in Montana. Shifting but never warming entirely. And she was aware of Thursday in the specific background way of someone who was not thinking about Thursday, and who was aware of it with a precision that told her that the not thinking about it was itself a form of thinking about it. Thursday was 3 days away. She was aware of the 3 days. She went to the fence line on Thursday, at the hour that the morning's necessary work was complete, and the afternoon's work had not yet become urgent, which was the hour that the fence line work typically occupied in her weekly schedule. He was already there when she arrived, which she had not expected and had somehow known. Waiting on the southern boundary section, with the focused, efficient quality of someone who knew the work and who was doing it rather than performing it. He looked up when he heard her and said, "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," he said. "The section is worse than I thought from the road assessment." He said it with the plain practicality of someone getting immediately to the work, and she received it with the same quality and said, "Show me." He showed her. They worked through the southern boundary section across the afternoon with the focused, parallel quality of two people who understood the same work and who were doing it together, with the specific ease that came from shared practical understanding. She was aware of him beside her in the specific way that was different from the peripheral awareness that had been her mode for the 11 months of the widowhood in Emberfield. Not the managed awareness of someone monitoring the social environment for the management of proximity, but the specific present awareness of someone who was genuinely attending to the person beside them because the person beside them was worth the genuine attending. He talked about the work with the plain, practical accuracy of someone who communicated primarily through the useful content of what was said, without the social elaboration that made conversation feel like it was being produced for an audience. She talked about the work the same way, and the conversation had the quality that she had been noticing since the May fence line conversation. The quality of two people who were doing a thing together and whose talking was the natural accompaniment to the doing, rather than a separate activity being managed alongside it. She told him about the specific challenge of the section they were working, which was a challenge she had assessed differently from how he had assessed it, and that their combined assessment was producing a better solution for. And he listened with the full quality and incorporated her assessment into the solution without the particular quality of someone who was accommodating. Her perspective they found less reliable than their own, but with the quality of someone who had found a better result from the combined assessment, and who was therefore using the combined assessment. She said, at some point in the afternoon when the work had reached the natural pause that fencing work produced between the assessment phase and the execution phase, "Tell me about the wildflowers." Not the ones on the fence post, those she understood, the ones in the section near the creek, where they come from and what they are specifically. He looked at her with the dark green eyes and said, "They come from a specific composition of the soil in that section." He said, "The creek deposit over the years has produced a layer of specific silt that holds moisture differently from the surrounding soil, and the wildflowers that grow in that specific composition are different in their color from the same species elsewhere in the valley, because the specific mineral content of the silt produces a slightly deeper color in the petals." She said, "You know that about a patch of wildflowers on your property?" He said, "I've been watching what grows where on that land for 6 years." He said, "The wildflowers in that section are one of the things I've been watching." She said, "Why?" He said, "Because they're worth watching." He said it with the plain quality that was not elaborated, and that was the full answer to the question. And she received the full answer with the full quality of her reception and said nothing further, because nothing further was required. She said at the end of the afternoon's work, when the section was addressed and the tools were being gathered, "The birthday." He said, "Yes." She said, "You heard me say it in May." He said, "Yes." She said, "I said it without weight." He said, "I know." She said, "I wasn't expecting it to be retained." He said, "I know that too." She said, "Why did you retain it?" He was quiet for a moment, the specific, thoughtful quiet of someone who was finding the honest answer rather than the convenient answer. He said, "Because the quality of how you said it told me what the not being remembered had been costing you." He said, "Not the saying of it." He said, "The specific quality of someone who has made their peace with not being remembered, and who says the not being remembered in the way of someone reporting the weather rather than in the way of someone expressing a need." He said that specific quality is something you learn to recognize when you've been paying attention to people long enough. He said, "And when you recognize it, you either act on the recognizing or you file it and move on. And I filed it and I didn't move on because moving on wasn't the honest available option." She looked at him in the afternoon light. She said, "You thought about it for 9 months." He said, "I didn't think about it continuously." He said, "I held it in the place where I keep things that are significant, and I let the appropriate response develop at its own pace." She said, "And the wildflowers were the appropriate response." He said, "Yes." She said, "On the morning of the day." He said, "On the morning of the day." He said it with the plain certainty of someone for whom the timing was simply the correct timing, and who had understood the correct timing from the beginning. She said, "Gideon." He said, "Yes." She said, "That is the most specific form of being heard that I have experienced in a very long time." He looked at her with the dark green eyes in the afternoon light. He said, "Yes." He said, "I know." She said, "You know." He said, "I know, because I've been paying attention." He said the quality of the attention tells you what the person needs, and in this specific case, what you needed was not a large thing, but the specific small thing that had not been given. And the specific small thing that had not been given was someone holding something you said, because you were the reason for the holding. She said, and you held it. He said, yes. She said, for 9 months. He said, for as long as it took to understand what the right thing to do with the holding was. She said, and the right thing was the wildflowers on the fence post. He said, yes. He said simply that. He said no note and no announcement, and nothing that required you to receive it in any particular way. He said simply, the evidence that you had been heard and that the hearing had produced something. She said, it produced something in me. She said it with the blue-gray eyes in the afternoon light, and something in them was the thing she had been managing back into the managed territory for 11 months, and that she was not managing back now. Simply allowing it to be present in the way that it was present. He received it with the dark green eyes and the warmth in them that was simply his quality, and said, good. He said it with the plain completeness of the word that was the fullest available expression of what he was feeling about what she had said. And she received the word with the full quality and understood that it was the fullest available expression, and that the fullest available expression was not diminished by its brevity, but was in fact more completely itself because of it. She walked back to the house with the afternoon around her and the Montana winter doing what Montana winter did in February, which was to be what it was without apology and without concession. She went inside, and she stood at the kitchen window with the wildflowers in the blue pitcher, in the last of the afternoon light, and she felt the specific quality of something that was difficult to name with the available vocabulary, because the available vocabulary had been organized around the managing of things, and this was a different quality. Was the quality of something that was not being managed, but that was simply being allowed to be present. The presence had a warmth in it that was the warmth of the specific small thing that had been given this morning, and of the Thursday afternoon that had followed it, and of the dark green eyes in the afternoon light, and of the plain completeness of a word that contained everything it needed to contain. She did not name it. She was not ready to name it. But she let it be present in the specific space of the kitchen with the wildflowers and the blue pitcher and the February light. And the letting it be present was itself the most significant available departure from the managing that had been her mode for the previous 3 years and the previous 11 months. She was not going to manage this. She understood that about herself in the specific, honest way she was coming to understand most of the important things, which was slowly and without rushing, and with the full quality of the understanding rather than the convenient version. She was not going to manage this. She was going to let it be what it was. Whatever it was. March arrived in Emberfield with the specific quality of a Montana March that had not yet decided whether it was going to be winter or the beginning of the end of winter, and that was expressing this indecision through the specific variety of its weather, which was the variety of a season in transition that had days of genuine warmth and days of serious cold, and days that contained both within the same 12 hours and that required of the people living inside it the specific adaptability of someone who had learned not to commit too fully to any single expectation about what the day was going to be when it started. Clara had been through one full Montana winter by March, and she was through the other side of it in the specific way of someone who had survived the first experience of something difficult and who was discovering that the survival had produced in them a specific form of knowledge that could not have been acquired any other way. She was working on the current commission with the focused, engaged quality that her work had been acquiring since February. Since the birthday morning and the Thursday fence line and the specific something that the two of those things together had begun to produce in her interior, which was the very early incremental recovery of the quality that had been the quality of her work before Henderson's Mill. The quality of work done by someone who was present in the doing of it, rather than executing it from behind the specific managed distance that had been her mode for too long. The commission was for Mrs. Aldred, who was the school teacher's wife, and who had brought Clara the most challenging commission she had received in Emberfield. A formal dress for the spring gathering that required a specific technique Clara had executed once before with considerable effort, and that she was executing now with the quality that came from being more present in the work than she had been in the previous attempt. She thought about him while she worked. not with the managed quality of someone who was monitoring a thought and deciding what to do with it, with the specific direct quality of someone who had given up managing this particular thing and who was allowing it to be present in the way that it was present. She thought about the fence line and the plain honest quality of how he talked about things, the specific way he said the most significant things in the same register he said everything else. Without elaboration and without the particular effort of someone who wanted the significance to be visible, simply the accurate statement of the true thing in the form the true thing required. She thought about the dark green eyes that were warm in a way she had not expected from the face in the frame. The warmth of someone who had been paying the right kind of attention to the world for a long time and who had found the world on balance, and despite its difficulties worth the attention. The Tuesday visits had changed in quality since February. They were the same in their external form. He came to town on Tuesdays for the supply errands, and she was often in the dry goods or on the main street, and they exchanged the pleasantries of people who were neighbors in the specific way of people who shared a fence line and who had done fence work together, and who had a specific understanding of each other that went past the general category of neighborly acquaintance. But the quality of the exchanges had changed in the specific way that things changed when the people engaged in them had passed through something together. The exchanges were still brief and still had the practical quality of two people who had a primary practical relationship and who were not yet anything more definite than that. But there was a specific additional quality in them that had not been present in the November or December or January versions, the quality of something acknowledged rather than only present. She found herself on Tuesday mornings with a portion of her attention on the town in the specific way that a portion of her attention was on the town when there was something in the town that warranted the attention, which was different from the general monitoring of the social environment that had been her previous mode. She was not waiting. She was clear with herself that the quality of anticipation she was feeling was not the quality of waiting for something that had been promised, but the quality of someone who found another person genuinely interesting and who found the occasions of the interest when the occasions were available. The distinction mattered to her in the specific, honest way that distinctions mattered to someone who had been wrong about similar distinctions before and who was committed to understanding the current version accurately. He stopped at the dry goods on the third Tuesday of March when she was at the counter, and they talked for 12 minutes about the specific quality of the March weather and the fence line work the thaw was going to require, and the specific challenges of the March soil in the section between their properties. The conversation had the quality that the fence line conversations had, which was the quality of two people who were talking about a practical thing, in a way that contained something else without either of them making the something else into an occasion. And at the end of the 12 minutes he said, "Saturday." She said, "What's Saturday?" He said, "The eastern section will need attention before the serious thaw." She said, "What time?" He said, "Early." She said, "I'll be there." He said, "Good." He said it with the plain completeness of his characteristic word, and he moved on to the next errand on the supply list, and she moved on to the remainder of her dry goods business and the Tuesday. Morning continued around both of them with the specific quality of a Tuesday that had produced something that was both small and significant. The Saturday fence line work had the quality that the Thursday fence line work had had in February. The specific easy parallel quality of two people who understood the same work and who were doing it together with the shared comprehension that produced a specific kind of efficiency that was different from the efficiency of the solo work and different from the efficiency of two people working in parallel with only the task as the organizing principle. They talked while they worked with the natural conversational quality that the work produced in them. The quality of talking that emerged from the doing of a shared thing, rather than talking that was organized for its own purpose. She told him about the current commission, about the specific technique it required and the history of her previous attempt at the technique, and the specific thing she understood now about the technique that she had not understood then, which was the thing about the quality of the attention being the determinant of the quality of the result. He listened with the full quality and asked the specific follow-up question that told her the listening was the genuine kind. And she answered with the pleasure that she was finding she felt when she talked to him about the work, which was the pleasure of someone who was genuinely understood in the specific domain they were talking about rather than politely received in the general territory of it. He told her about the cross-spread spring preparation, about the specific decisions he was making about the cattle rotation and the reasoning behind the decisions. about the particular challenge of a section of the North Pasture that had been developing a drainage issue and the specific solution he was working out for it. She listened with the same genuine quality and asked the questions that showed she understood the practical territory of what he was describing, which she did because she had been managing her own property's practical requirements for 11 months and had learned the specific practical language of the Montana high country farming operation from the inside. She said in the middle of the Eastern section's work, "You said last Thursday that you kept things in a place where significant things went." He said, "Yes." She said, "What else is in there?" He considered this with the specific, honest consideration that was his mode for things that warranted it. He said things about the land, mostly. He said the specific quality of the North Pasture in the early morning of the first thaw in spring. He said the specific sound the creek makes in the middle of the night in July, when the water is at the summer level and the night is entirely still. He said the specific quality of the light in the eastern sky before the dawn in October, when the air is cold enough to carry the light differently than it carries it in the warmer months. She said, "You've been filing these things?" He said, "Yes." She said, "For 6 years." He said, "For most of my life." He said, "The cross spread gives me more specific material than most places I've lived because the specific quality of the high country land here is different from other places I've been, and the difference is worth noting." She said, "Do you tell anyone about them?" He said, "There wasn't anyone to tell them to." He said it with the plain quality of someone stating a fact rather than expressing a complaint, and she received it the same way as the fact it was, and said, "Tell me about the October light." He said specifically. She said specifically, he told her. He told her about the October light in the eastern sky, before the dawn, with the specific, accurate detail of someone who had been noting it for 6 years and who was telling it to someone for the first time, and who was finding the telling to be the specific pleasure that the telling of something that had been held carefully for a long time was when the person receiving it was genuinely receiving it. She listened with the full quality and the blue-gray eyes, and when he finished, she said, "That is one of the most beautiful things I have heard described." He said, "Most people don't notice it." She said, "You notice everything." He said, "I notice what's worth noticing." He said, "The list is longer than most people's." She said, "What else is on the list?" He said, "Do you want the full inventory?" She said, "I want everything on the list." He said, "That will take some time." She said, "I know." She said, "That's why I want it." The March visits settled into a pattern with the specific naturalness of something that was simply what it was, rather than something that was being managed into what it was. He came on Tuesdays, and she saw him in the course of the Tuesday business. And the fence line work on Saturdays became the established form of the shared practical occasions that produced the shared practical conversations. And the conversations moved in the direction that honest conversations between two people who had found each other genuinely interesting moved towards, in the direction of the things that were worth saying. She was telling him things she had not told anyone in Emberfield, not the center of what she was carrying, not yet, but the things that were adjacent to the center and that came out in the natural direction of honest conversation, the way the adjacent things came out when the conditions for the coming out were the right conditions. She told him about her father and the specific quality of his attention, which was the quality she had inherited and that she was finding in the conversations with Gideon. Was the quality she valued most in another person because it was the quality that produced genuine understanding rather than impression. The quality that retained what was said because the person was the reason for the retaining. He listened and said, "Yes." He said, "That's the quality that determines most things that matter." She said, "You have it." He said, "I learned it from my mother." He said she was the person who noticed what wasn't being said as clearly as what was. She said, "That's the harder skill." He said, "Yes." He said, "But it's also the more useful one." She said, "Because the most significant things are usually in what isn't being said." He said, "Usually." He said, "Not always." She said, "Sometimes the most significant things are said directly and plainly, and the difficulty is not in the hearing of them but in the receiving of them as what they are." She said, "What do you mean?" He said, "I mean that sometimes a person says something true directly, and the person hearing it manages the receiving of it into something that requires less from them than the full truth would require." She said, "And you think the full receiving is better?" he said. I think the full receiving is the only honest available response to something said plainly. He said the managing of it is a form of the avoidance, and the avoidance is a form of the not being present, and the not being present is the specific thing that makes people invisible to each other. She looked at him across the fence line in the March afternoon. She said, "Is that what happened to you?" He was quiet for a moment. He said once, a long time ago. He said, I was on the receiving end of someone who was managing what I said rather than receiving it, and I understood from the inside what the managing felt like, and I decided I was not going to be the person who did it to someone else. She said, that's a specific thing to decide. He said, the specific things are usually the ones worth deciding. She said, yes. She said, they are. She brought him tea on the last Saturday of March at the end of the fence line work, which she had not done before and which she did now because the doing of it was the available natural thing, and because the available natural thing was what she was beginning to do instead of the managed thing. She had made it in the morning before the fence line work and brought it in the thermos that was the practical available container. And she poured him a cup at the fence line, and he received it with the plain, genuine quality of someone for whom the small practical kindness was exactly what it was. And they stood at the fence line with the cups in the March afternoon and drank the tea in the specific, easy, parallel quality that was becoming the quality of their time together at the fence line. The quality that did not require anything from the moment except that the moment be what it was. He said the obsidian in the creek bed near the south section has been showing since the thaw started. He said, I found a piece yesterday with the specific quality of waterworked stone that catches the light differently from polished stone. He said, I thought of you. She said, why? He said, you said once that you liked the specific quality of things that were shaped by sustained, patient, natural processes rather than by the deliberate effort to produce a specific result. She said, I said that. He said in October. He said at the fence line. He said in a conversation about the needlework. She said, I said it in passing. He said, I know. She said, and you retained it. He said, you were the reason for the retaining. He said it with the same plain quality he had used on the birthday morning when he had said it the first time, and she received it with the same full quality she had received it with then, which was the quality of someone who had heard something true said plainly, and who was choosing to receive it as the true thing rather than managing it into something that required less. She said, Gideon. He said, yes. She said, tell me something else from the list. He said, the list is long. She said, I know. He said, where do you want me to start? She said, start wherever the starting feels right. He started. He told her about the creek sound in July, the specific sound of water at the summer level in the complete silence of the middle of the night at altitude. And she listened with the blue-gray eyes and the full quality of her attention, and the March afternoon was around them, and the tea was warm in her hands and the fence line was between them, and she was not managing any of it. She was simply there, in the specific present quality of being simply there. She was finding the most available and most valuable thing. April in Emberfield had the specific quality of a Montana April that was fully committed to being the transition it was. Neither the last of the winter nor the first of the real spring, but the honest middle of the movement between them. The quality of a month that understood its function was to take the landscape from one condition to another, and that was executing the function with the patient thoroughness of something that understood the work, required the full duration of the month, and was not going to rush it. The ground was softening in the southern-facing sections. First, the way ground softened at this elevation gradually and unevenly, and the creek was beginning the specific restlessness that preceded the serious snowmelt by 2 to 3 weeks. The early rising that told the people who had been watching it long enough what was coming. Clara had been watching it for one full cycle now, and she could read the early signs in a way she had not been able to read them the previous year, which was the specific knowledge of the place that came from the inside and that could not be acquired from the description of it. She was in the deep current of the interior work in April, doing it with the quality that the specific conditions of the April had made available, which were the conditions of having had the February and March fence line conversations and the Tuesday exchanges and the specific accumulation of the things she had been telling him and the things he had been telling her. The accumulation of honest exchange between two people who had found each other to be someone worth the honest exchange. The interior work was the work that was closest to the center of what she was carrying. The work that was most requiring of the specific patient honesty that she had been developing since leaving Henderson's mill. And it was going the way honest interior work went when the conditions were right. Which was not dramatically but thoroughly, and in the specific way of things that were being understood rather than managed. She told him more in April than she had told him in March. Not the center yet. She was still in the process of understanding whether the center was something she was ready to offer and in what form. And she was not going to force the process before it was ready, because the forcing would have produced an incomplete result, and the incomplete result was not what either of them deserved. But the things adjacent to the center came out in the specific natural direction of their conversations. And the April conversations had the quality of conversations that were more honest than the March conversations had been, which were more honest than the February conversations. Which was the specific direction that conversations between two people who were building something real went when they were building it correctly. She told him about the specific quality of the years in Henderson's mill. Not in the full accounting, but in the specific impressionistic way of someone who was communicating the texture of something rather than its full inventory. And he received the texture with the complete quality, and he said the thing that was true rather than the thing that was comfortable, which was the specific quality of someone who has been invisible to the person they were living with is a specific quality that stays in the body longer than most people expect it to. She said, yes. She said, does. He said, the body keeps the accounting more accurately than the mind does. She said, yes. She said, the mind can decide it has moved on before the body has. He said, yes. He said, the work is in the body catching up to the decision. She said, that's where I am. He said, I know. He said it with the simple acknowledgement of someone who had been paying the right kind of attention and who had understood what he was looking at. She said, how do you know? He said, because the quality of your presence in the fence line, conversations in April is different from the quality in March, and the quality in March was different from February. And the direction of the change is the direction of someone whose body is doing the specific catching up. She said, you've been watching the direction. He said, I pay attention to the direction of things. He said, it's usually more informative than the position. She said, the direction rather than the position? He said, yes. He said, the position tells you where something is. He said, the direction tells you where it's going. She said, and the direction I'm going, he said, toward. He said it with the plain quality, and she received it with the full quality. And they were at the fence line in the April morning, and neither of them made it into anything other than what it was. Which was enough. He brought her a piece of the creek obsidian in the second week of April. The specific piece he had found in March and had mentioned in March and that he had been carrying since, because the carrying had been the natural response to having found something specific and knowing who it was for. He set it on the fence post without ceremony when he arrived for the Saturday work, the same way he had left the wildflowers, without announcement, simply placed where she would see it. She saw it, and she picked it up and held it in the April light that was the specific quality of April light at altitude in Montana. Clear and still cold, but carrying within it the intimation of what was coming, and the obsidian in the April light had the specific quality he had described. The quality of waterworked stone that caught the light differently from polished stone because the working was the honest product of sustained patient process rather than deliberate effort. She said, this is what you were describing in March. He said, yes. She said, the section near the south boundary. He said, the south boundary fence post, specifically. He said, the creek has been depositing in that section for longer than I've had the property. He said, the result is the specific material you're holding. She said, the sustained patient natural process producing a specific result. He said, yes. She said, you kept it for me. He said, I found it in March and I knew who it was for. She said, how did you know? He said, because you were the reason I noticed it. She said it with the blue-gray eyes in the April light, and she held the obsidian and said nothing further about it, because nothing further needed to be said. She simply held it in the light for a moment, and let the holding be the full receiving of the giving. And then she put it in the pocket of her work apron beside the fence post, nails she had been using for the section work, and they went back to the work. She was aware of him across the April weeks with the full quality of awareness rather than the managed peripheral quality that had been her mode for the 11 months before February. She was aware of the specific quality of how he moved through the practical work of the fence line, which was the quality of someone for whom the work was the expression of a thoroughness that was internal rather than performed. Not working to produce a result that would be assessed, but working because the correct execution of the work was itself the available form of his relationship to the land and the task and the person he was working alongside. She was aware of the specific quality of his humor, which she had found in March and was finding more of in April. The dry, understated quality that appeared in the specific pauses of the conversation when something was genuinely funny rather than socially amusing. And that was itself the evidence of someone whose interior engagement with the world was different from their surface presentation in the specific direction of more than it appeared rather than less. She was aware of the specific quality of his silence, which was the silence of someone who was present and thinking rather than the silence of someone who had run out of things to say or who was managing the space of the conversation. She had learned to read his silences in the specific way she had learned to read his humor, which was through the sustained, patient attention of someone who was genuinely interested in the person they were attending to, rather than in the impression the attending was producing. And what she was reading in the silences was the specific quality of someone whose interior engagement was thorough and continuous, and who was simply not directing all of it through the channel of language. The darkest moment arrived in the third week of April, in the form that darkest moments in small communities tended to arrive, which was through the specific channel of genuine care expressed through a framework that was not entirely the correct framework for the specific situation it was being applied to. It arrived through Mrs. Hartley, who was the minister's wife and who was one of the 3 women who had been the most consistently warm and welcoming to Clara in the 11 months of the Emberfield residency, and whose care for Clara's well-being was entirely genuine, and who arrived on a Wednesday afternoon with preserved plums and the specific, warm, purposeful manner of a woman who had something to say and who had decided that the caring required the saying. Mrs. Hartley sat at the kitchen table, and she accepted the tea, and she said what she had come to say with the complete warmth and complete sincerity of someone whose love for the person she was talking to was real, and whose framework for expressing the love was the framework of the community and the time, which was not always the right framework for every specific situation it was applied to, but was always genuine in its intention. She said that people in the community had been noticing the fence line work and the Tuesday exchanges, and that the noticing was warm, but that it also produced the specific social expectations that the noticing in a small community produced, and that she wanted to make sure Clara understood what the noticing was producing, and that she had the opportunity to make whatever decisions she needed to make with that understanding available to her. She said all of it with complete love, and Clara received it with the specific composed grace she had been developing for 3 years and 11 months, and she thanked Mrs. Hartley and said she appreciated the caring, and she saw her out the door, and she closed the door, and she stood in the kitchen with the tea going cold on the table, and the preserved plums on the counter, and the obsidian on the windowsill beside the blue pitcher that she had replaced the dried wildflowers with a small jar of creek stones she had collected in March. She sat at the table. She did not pick up the tea. She sat with the specific quality of someone who had been reminded of something they had been managing around, which was the specific social architecture of the situation she was in and what that architecture required of the person occupying it. She sat with it honestly, with the full quality of the honest attention she had been developing, and she let the sitting produce the understanding rather than managing it toward a conclusion. The understanding arrived with the specific slowness of things that required the full sitting with rather than the rushed analysis. Arrived across the hour, she sat with the cold tea and the preserved plums and the April light through the kitchen window, and what it was this: she was afraid. Not of him. The fear was not about him at all, or it was about him only in the specific way that fears about vulnerability were about the particular person through whom the vulnerability was open. The fear was about the specific quality of what was happening, which was the quality of something that mattered to her in the specific way, that things that could be lost mattered. And the mattering was itself the evidence that she had been wrong about something she had thought she had fully understood, which was the idea that the managing was the protection. The managing was not the protection. The managing was the appearance of the protection. The actual protection was not available because the actual protection from the specific cost of caring about something was not to care about it. And she had been caring about this for 2 months in the specific honest way that she had given up managing. And the giving up of the managing meant the protection was given up with it. And what was present in its place was the specific open quality of someone who had something to lose. She sat with the open quality, and she sat with the fear that was the natural accompaniment of the open quality, and she let both of them be present with the honesty she had been bringing to most things since February. And the letting of both of them be present was itself a form of the decision, the specific decision of whether to close back up or to stay open, and the staying open was what she was choosing. Was what the understanding that had been building since the birthday morning was pointing toward, and the pointing was clear enough by April that the choice, when it was required, was the choice she had already made. She went to find him the next morning. Not the fence line this time. She went to the cross spread itself, which she had not done before. And she went because the thing she needed to say required the directness of going to the person rather than waiting for the available occasion. He was in the yard when she arrived, doing the morning's first assessment of the thaw's progress in the way of someone for whom the daily reading of the land's condition was the first thing of every morning. And he looked up when he heard the horse, and he waited with the specific patient quality of his waiting, which was the waiting that did not require the waited for to hurry, but that was simply present to the arriving. She said, "Mrs. Hartley came yesterday." He said, "I heard." She said, "The community is noticing." He said, "I expected they would." She said, "You continued to come to the fence line anyway." He said, "Yes." She said, "Why?" He was quiet for the specific thoughtful length of time. He said, "Because the fence line is where our conversations happen, and the conversations are what they are, and the community's noticing does not change what the conversations are." He said, "I was not going to stop doing the right thing because someone might notice the doing of it." She said, "Mrs. Hartley's concern is genuine." He said, "Yes." He said, "And her framework for the concern is not entirely the right framework for what is actually happening." She said, "She doesn't have the information about what is actually happening." He said, "No." He said, "What is actually happening?" He said it with the plain, direct quality of someone asking the question that was the actual question, and she looked at him in the April morning with the blue-gray eyes, and she said, "What is actually happening is that I have been doing the interior work that my history required me to do, and the interior work is not finished. And while I have been doing the interior work, I have been having conversations at the fence line with someone who retains what I say because I am the reason for the retaining, and who has been filing beautiful things for years waiting for someone to tell them to. And the having of those conversations has been the most significant available experience of the interior work, because the conversations have shown me what the work is building toward." He said, "Tell me what it is building toward." She said, "Toward the specific quality of being genuinely present with another person without managing the presence." He said, "Are you there?" She said, "Not fully." He said, "How far?" She said, "Further than I was in February." She said, "That is the honest answer." He said, "Yes." He said, "It is." He said, "Addie." He said it with the plain, warm quality of someone using her name as a form of the complete attention, and she received it. He said, "I'm not going anywhere." She said, "I know." She said, "That is part of what the fence line conversations have shown me." He said, "Good." He said it with the plain completeness of the word, and she said, "Good." She said it back to him in the same register, and the morning was around them, and the cross spread was behind him, and the April thaw was in the ground under their feet, and neither of them looked away. May arrived in Emberfield with the specific quality of a Montana May that had earned its beauty through the winter that preceded it, the specific quality of a season that was giving back in proportion to what had been given through the months of the cold. The wild flowers in the section near the creek were returning in the first week of May, with the specific patient inevitability of things that had been there before the winter, and that would be there after it. Coming back in the specific incremental way of something that was not announcing itself, but was simply becoming present again because the conditions for the becoming were there. Clara watched them from the fence line on the morning of the first Tuesday of May, and she thought about the February morning and the fence post and the 2 words she had said to the empty field, and she understood. Watching the wildflowers return to the creek section, that the returning was itself the quality she had been building toward since February. which was the quality of something that had been present before the winter and that was coming back because the conditions for the coming back were finally there. She had been doing the interior work with the full honest quality she had been bringing to it since February. And the work had been going the way the honest interior work went when you were doing it correctly, which was in the direction of the real thing rather than the convenient approximation of it. She had been understanding what the 3 years in Henderson's Mill had been and what the carrying of it had cost and what the cost meant about what she needed and what she was capable of. And the understanding had been developing across the February and March and April weeks with the specific accumulating quality of something that was building toward a completeness that was not yet there, but that was approaching with the patient certainty of things that were going to arrive because the right work was being done toward them. She thought about what she was going to say to him. Not in the organized way of someone preparing a speech or planning a disclosure, in the specific honest way of someone who had been arriving at something for 3 months and who understood. In the May morning with the wildflowers coming back to the creek section, that the arriving was nearly complete and that the thing she had to do when it was complete was to say it directly and in the plain form that the directness required. Because anything less than the direct saying was the specific form of the managing that she had been given up and that she was not going to return to. She went to the fence line on a Thursday, in the second week of May, with no practical reason for the fence line beyond the reason of needing to say the thing that needed saying. He was at the shared section doing the spring maintenance work that the thaw had revealed was necessary. The kind of thorough, systematic attention to the fence infrastructure that was his characteristic response to any section that had been through the winter and that needed assessing from the ground up. He looked up when she arrived and said, "Good morning." She said, "Good morning." She said, "I need to tell you something." He set the tool down with the unhurried quality of someone for whom the setting down of a tool was not an interruption, but the natural response to the available priority. And he turned toward her with the full quality of his attention, the dark green eyes warm in the May morning, and the complete present quality of someone who was entirely where they were. She said, "I have been doing the interior work since I arrived in Emberfield." He said, "Yes." She said, "The work has been the specific work of understanding what the 3 years in Henderson's Mill were and what the carrying of them has cost, and what the cost means about who I am now and what the life I'm building is building toward." He said, "Yes." She said, "You have been present at the edges of that work since February, and your being present at the edges has been significant to the work in a way I want to be honest about." He said, "Tell me," she said. "The conversations at the fence line have shown me what I have been building toward." He said, "What have you been building toward?" She said, "The specific quality of being known by someone who is paying the right kind of attention." She said, "I have been building toward the understanding that the right kind of attention exists and that it is available and that I do not have to manage myself into the smallest possible version of myself to be safe in the presence of it." He said, "And you have that understanding now." She said, "I have been arriving at it for 3 months." She said, "I am saying this because the arriving is close enough to the complete that the not saying of it is less honest than the saying." He said, "Yes." He said it with the dark green eyes and the warm, patient quality. She said, "I have been in love with you since approximately the 3rd Saturday fence line in March." He said, "When you told me about the October light and asked to hear everything on the list," she said, "Yes." He said, "Yes." She said, "You knew." He said, "I understood." Something had shifted in March. He said, "I was waiting for the arriving to complete itself before I said anything about what I understood." She said, "You were waiting for me again?" He said, "Yes." She said, "How long have you been waiting?" He said, "Since the birthday wildflowers." He said that was when I understood that what I had been noting about you for 11 months had arrived at the specific form that telling you about it was the appropriate response to. She said, "The wildflowers were the beginning of the telling." He said, "Yes," she said. "And you waited from February to May for me to arrive at the completing?" He said, "Yes." He said, "Some things require the arriving to be complete before the meeting can happen." He said, "Attempting to rush the arriving produces an incomplete result, and the incomplete result is not what either person deserves." She said, "You told me in March that the managing was a form of the avoidance, and the avoidance was the thing that made people invisible to each other." He said, "Yes." She said, "I am not managing this." He said, "I know." He said, I can see that you're not. She said, the not managing is available because of the specific quality of what you have been demonstrating since February. He said, tell me what I have been demonstrating. She said that the attention is organized around me and not around what the attention produces for the person providing it. He said, yes. She said that the retaining is real and not performed. He said, yes. She said that the fence line is not a means to something else, but is itself the thing. He said, yes. Said, it is itself the thing, she said, and the thing is building toward something. He said, yes. She said, tell me what it is building toward. He said, you. He said it with the plain quality and the dark green eyes and the May morning around them and the wildflowers in the creek section behind him at their specific early May quality of something just returned from the winter. He said, the building is toward you specifically. He said, not the category. He said, you. She said, yes. She said it with the same plain quality and the blue-gray eyes that were showing everything, which was the most specific available departure from the managing that had been her characteristic mode for 3 years and 11 months, and that was not her mode now, and that she understood, standing at the fence line in the May morning, was not going to be her mode again, in the specific domain where she was not managing. He reached across the fence line and he took her hands in both of his, the enormous calloused hands that had left wildflowers on a fence post in February and obsidian on a fence post in March, and that had worked alongside her hands at the fence line across the months of the fence line conversations. And the warmth of them was exactly what she had understood. The warmth would be from the quality of his presence across the months, which was the warmth of someone whose warmth was the direct, honest expression of what they felt, rather than the performance of what they thought they were supposed to feel. She felt the warmth and she did not manage it, and she was entirely in the feeling of it. She said, Gideon. He said, yes. She said, I have more interior work to do. He said, I know. She said, I am not finished. He said, I know. He said, I am not asking you to be finished. He said, I am telling you that I have been patient for 11 months and for 3 months more since February, and that the patience was the right thing, because you needed the time, and the time needed to be yours. He said, and I am telling you that the patience has produced the correct result because you are standing at this fence line telling me directly and in the plain form what is true, and the telling of it directly and in the plain form is the specific thing that the patience was for. She said, the patience was for this. He said, yes. She said, the wildflowers were the patience made visible. He said, the wildflowers were the one form of the patience that the birthday permitted. He said, the birthday was the specific occasion that permitted a specific expression. He said, the patience before and after the birthday was its own thing. She said, you have been patient since November. He said, since November of the year before last. He said, since the second week. She said, that is more than a year of patience. He said, yes. She said, for me. He said, for the specific arriving that was required. He said, the arriving needed the time it needed, and I was not going to interfere with the time it needed. She said, you trusted the process. He said, I trusted that the right thing done at the right time in the right form would produce the right result. He said, the right thing was the patience. He said, the right time was when the arriving was complete. He said, the right form is this. She said, this. She said it and looked at her hands in his and looked up at him with the blue-gray eyes and said, this is the right form. He said, yes. He said it with the dark green eyes and the warmth that was simply his quality, and she looked at him in the May morning at the fence line and she said, tell me something from the list. He said, there is a specific quality to the light on the creek section in the early May morning when the wildflowers are coming back from the winter that is different from the quality at any other time of year. He said, the light in May on those specific flowers at this specific hour is the quality of something that has come back from a difficult season, and that is entirely itself again because the conditions are finally right. She said, that is what you see in it. He said, that is what it is. He said, I have been waiting to tell someone about it. He said, I have been waiting to tell you about it specifically. She said, tell me. He told her. He told her about the May light on the wildflowers in the creek section with the specific patient, beautiful detail of someone who had been holding the telling for a long time and who was now giving it to the person it had been for all along. and she listened with the full quality of her attention and the blue-gray eyes, and the May morning around them, and the wildflowers in the creek section, exactly as he was describing them, and she understood. Listening to him describe the thing she could see over his shoulder, while he described it, that this was the specific quality of being known in the way she had been building toward. Not the knowing of the general category she occupied, but the knowing of the specific things she had said and the specific quality of how she had said them, and the specific understanding of what the sayings were about that had been retained and acted on by someone for whom she was, the reason for the retaining. The wildflowers were on the fence post again, she understood. They had been on the fence post in February on the morning of the birthday, and they were on the fence post now in May, in the specific form of being described back to her by the person who had been noting them for 6 years and who had understood. From the quality of a thing she had said once about beauty, that she was the person to tell. She said, "I want to show you the current commission work." He said, "Saturday?" She said, "Saturday." He said, "I'll bring something." She said, "Something from the list." He said, "Yes." He said, "Something from the list," she said. She said it, and she did not let go of his hands, and he did not let go of hers. And the May morning continued around them both with the specific quality of the month that had come back from the winter. And that was entirely itself again, because the conditions were finally right. She said, "Gideon?" He said, "Yes." She said, "The Saturday supper," she said, "not for the commission work." She said, "The commission work is available, but it is not the reason." He said, "What is the reason?" She said, "I want you to come for supper because I want you to be at my table in the way that means what it means and not in the way of a practical occasion." He said, "Yes." He said, "I understand the distinction." She said, "Good." She said, 6 o'clock. He said, "Yes." He said, "I'll be there." He said it with the plain certainty of his characteristic statement of what was going to happen, and she received the certainty and said, "I know you will." She said it with the specific quality of someone who had understood something important about another person over sufficient time to say it, with the confidence of someone who had the evidence. And he received the quality of the saying with the dark green eyes and the expression that was his fullest expression, which was barely visible on the surface and entirely genuine in the depth of it. She released his hands and she turned back toward the small house on the eastern edge of Emberfield, and she walked with the May morning around her and the wildflowers in the creek section behind her, and she was entirely herself in the specific way she had been building towards since November of the year before last. Not the managed version and not the smallest available version, but the actual version. The one that paid the right kind of attention and that had small freckles across the bridge of her nose, and that wore a silver thimble out of habit, and that had been saying small true things at the fence line for 3 months, and that was going home to make the supper she was going to serve on Saturday to a man who had left wildflowers on a fence post because the leaving of them was simply the right thing. She was going home. To her actual home. In the specific place that had become it. At the specific time that was always going to be when he came on Saturday at 6 o'clock with something from the list, which was a small jar of the early May honey from the crossbreeds hive in the south section. The honey that was produced from the specific wildflowers of the creek section in the first weeks of their returning, and that had a flavor that was different from the summer. Honey in the specific way that things were different when they were made from the beginning of something rather than from the middle of it. He set it on the kitchen table when she opened the door, and he said, "From the south hive," he said, "the early May harvest." He said, "It's the smallest yield of the season, but the specific flavor of the first flowers is something the summer honey doesn't have." She looked at the jar in the kitchen light, and she said, "The wildflowers from the creek section." He said, "Yes." She said, "You made this from the specific flowers you were describing at the fence line on Thursday?" He said, "The bees made it." He said, "I provided the circumstances." She said, "That's how most valuable things are made." He said, "Yes." He said it with the plain quality, and she received it and said, "Come in." The Saturday supper had the quality she had understood it would have when she had named it at the fence line, which was the quality of something that was itself, rather than a means to something else. Not the casual social occasion, and not the practical continuation of the fence line work, but the specific thing of two people who had arrived at the place where the supper meant what it meant, and who were having it with the full acknowledgement of the meaning. She had cooked with the specific pleasure of someone who was cooking for another person for the first time in a long time and who had recovered or was recovering. The quality of the pleasure that cooking for someone you wanted to feed produced, the quality that was different from cooking for necessity, in the same way that the early May honey was different from the summer honey, which was the quality of something made from the beginning rather than from the middle. He ate with the specific attentive pleasure of someone for whom good food was a genuine pleasure and who was not performing the appreciation but simply experiencing it. And he told her the specific things about the flavors that told her he was genuinely tasting what she had made rather than executing the social ritual of the compliment. And she received the genuine tasting as the specific form of attention it was, which was the same form his attention always took. The form that was organized around the actual thing rather than the impression the thing was supposed to produce. They talked across the supper table with the quality of the fence-line conversations at the kitchen table. The quality of two people who had been learning each other for months, and who were learning each other still, and who were doing it at a table in a kitchen with food between them rather than at a fence line with tools, which was a different context for the same essential activity. After supper, she brought the early May honey to the table with the cornbread she had made, because cornbread and early May honey in Montana in the spring was the specific right thing. And he tasted it with the specific attentiveness he brought to things from the list. The attentiveness of someone who had been noting the quality of the things he made and found and experienced across the 6 years of the cross spread, and who was sharing the noting with the person he had understood was the person to share it with. He said, "The first flowers and the honey." She said, "Yes." He said, "It tastes like the beginning of something." She said, "Yes." She said, "Most specific things really are about something else." He looked at her with the dark green eyes across the kitchen table, and the quality of the warmth in them was the warmth she had been learning since February, and that she understood by May was simply how they were when they were looking at her. Which was the specific quality of someone for whom she was the most important thing currently occurring, and who was not performing that quality, but simply expressing it because it was the natural expression of what was true. She said, "Gideon." He said, "Yes." She said, "Tell me something from the list." He said, "Which one?" She said, "The one that is most specifically about this." He was quiet for the moment of the honest consideration. He said, "The specific quality of the cross-spread kitchen on a Saturday evening in May has been on the list since approximately the third Saturday fence line in March." She said, "It wasn't available then." He said, "No." He said, "But I put it on the list when I understood what it was going to be." She said, "You knew in March." He said, "I understood in March what it was going to become when it became it." He said, "The list includes things I have experienced and things I have understood were going to be worth experiencing." He said, "This was in the second category since March." She said, "And now it's in the first." He said, "Yes." He said it with the dark green eyes and the plain quality, and the kitchen was warm around them, and the early May honey was on the table. He asked her in June, not in the organized way of someone who had staged the occasion and who was presenting the asking as a performance of its significance, but in the specific plain form that was his characteristic form for things that mattered most. At the fence line on a Saturday morning in the early light with the Montana June around them and the wildflowers in the creek section, at the beginning of their full month. He said, "I want to ask you something." She said, "Ask." He said, "I want to build something with you." He said, "Not the fence line, which is the current form of what we're building, and not the commission work or the supply errands or the Tuesday exchanges." He said, "I want to build the thing that those are the preliminary form of, which is the actual shared life of two people who have been learning each other at a fence line for months and who have arrived at the understanding that the fence line was always going to become something else." She said, "Are you asking me to marry you?" He said, "Yes." He said it with the plain quality. She looked at him with the blue-gray eyes that were showing everything. She said, "Yes." She said it with the same plain completeness, the word that contained everything it needed to contain, and he received it with the dark green eyes and the fullest expression, but barely visible and entirely genuine. He said, "The fence line will still be there." She said, "Yes." She said, "But the quality of what it is will be different." He said, "Yes." He said, "The fence line between two adjacent properties managed by two adjacent people who are learning each other is a different fence line from the fence line on a property managed by two people who have made the thing they were building." She said, "The fence line on our property." He said, "Yes." He said, "The fence line on our property." She said it back to him. And the June morning was around them, and the wildflowers were in the creek section, and the specific light of the early Montana June was the light she had been learning to read. Across the year and a half of her residency, and that she understood now in the body rather than the mind. She looked at the wildflowers over his shoulder, and she thought about the February morning and the fence post, and the 2 words she had said to the empty field that had been the most honest 2 words she had said in a very long time. You remembered? She had said it to the field, and she had meant it for him. And what she had meant by it was not only the birthday, but the larger thing. The birthday was the symbol of, which was the specific quality of being heard by someone who retained what she said because she was the reason for the retaining. The quality that she had stopped expecting and that had been present all along in the person on the other side of the fence line, who had been paying the right kind of attention since November of the year before last. She had been heard not in the general social sense, but in the specific retaining sense. The wildflowers were the proof, the obsidian was the proof, the list was the proof. The Thursday fence line that was about the southern boundary section that he had said would go faster with 2, but that was about something else entirely, was the proof. The early May honey from the specific bees that made their honey from the specific flowers he had been noting for 6 years, and that he had understood were 4, was the proof. Every piece of it was the proof of the same single true thing, which was that she had been heard in the specific way that she had given up, expecting to be heard. And the hearing had produced in the person doing the hearing the specific ongoing response of someone for whom the heard thing was the reason for everything that followed. There's a lesson in Clara's story that belongs to everyone who has ever said a small true thing without weight and without expectation, and who has been surprised by the evidence that the small true thing was retained by someone who had been paying the right kind of attention. Everyone who has ever mentioned once in passing, in the middle of a conversation about something else, a small specific thing about themselves that they did not expect to be particularly noted or remembered, and that was noted and remembered because the person listening was the kind of person who listened with the specific quality of someone for whom the person speaking was the reason the listening was happening. The birthday that was not remembered for 3 years is the birthday that is remembered this year. Not by a grand gesture and not by a performance of caring, by the specific plain form of wildflowers on a fence post, placed where you will find them on the morning you need to find them. By someone who heard you say a small true thing 9 months ago and who held it in the place where significant things are held and who understood, when the morning arrived, that the right response to the holding was to act on it in the specific form that required nothing from you but your finding it. The finding of it is everything. The finding of it is the moment when you understand that you have been heard in the way you stopped expecting to be heard. And the understanding changes the quality of everything that follows it because you know now that the right kind of attention exists and that it is available and that you do not have to make yourself into the smallest possible version of yourself to be safe in the presence of it. You are allowed to say the small, true things without weight. You are allowed to say them, and to let them surface when the conversation has the quality that permits the surfacing, and to not manage them back into the managed territory, because the managed territory is safe. The fence post is there. The wildflowers are tied with twine. The person who left them has been paying the right kind of attention for longer than you knew. Attention was being paid. You were worth the remembering. You have always been worth the remembering. The question was only whether the right person was listening. The right person was listening. May you find the strength to heal and the hope of a new dawn. Thank you for listening. This story is a work of fiction. Characters, places, and events are products of the author's imagination. All rights reserved by Cowboy Ironheart.